Hello, and a very warm welcome to the Liz Earle Wellbeing Show. Now, in this week's episode, we are going to be talking about women's health and taking a closer look at how and why women are let down by our healthcare systems, particularly when it comes to chronic pain. I'm joined today by Gabrielle Jackson, a celebrated journalist who turned her eye to this topic after being diagnosed with endometriosis in 2001. A staggering 1 in 10 women of reproductive age are diagnosed with endometriosis, and yet it remains a condition that we know startlingly little about. More than a decade after her initial diagnosis, Gabrielle was shocked how little progress had been made in both the treatment and the understanding of this all too common condition. This prompted her to publish her own personal story in The Guardian, Australia, something that kick-started an illuminating campaign by the paper. Very quickly, the personal stories of hundreds of women poured in, and Gabrielle started to explore the ways women are let down by our healthcare professionals, from doctors underestimating their pain to their conditions being under-researched. She's now written a book, Pain and Prejudice, a call to arms for women and their bodies. And we've just had a really interesting chat about why women aren't always taken seriously by our doctors, why conditions like endometriosis are still under-researched and underfunded, and how we as women can even internalize biases that deprive us of the help we need and deserve. And don't worry, she'll be giving us a few action steps we can take to help ensure that we're getting proper care and that other women are too. Don't forget that if you'd like to watch our chat today, the video podcast is available on YouTube. And as always, I am looking forward to hearing your thoughts on Instagram after the show. And so let's hear it from Gabrielle. So, Gabrielle, a really, really warm welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us all the way from Sydney, Australia. It's a pleasure to be talking to you. I've followed you. I know a little bit about your journey, and I'm really looking forward to talking some more. Can you really start by taking us on a little bit of your personal journey here?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always happy to do it because people always tell me I'm describing their lives. So I was the girl in high school who was in the sick bay every month, and month after month it would be terrible. Like not period pain, but leg pain. Sometimes I have migraine, vomiting, and diarrhea, and no one ever seemed to think that there was anything wrong with this. One GP told me some women have bad period pain, you just have to live with it. And I was at one stage diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome. I went through, finished high school, got on the pill like a lot of people to see if that could help manage my periods a bit better. And it wasn't until I was 23 that I actually said to my GP, no, I'm sorry, this isn't right. I don't see anyone I know going through this. I want a referral to a gynecologist. I actually had to demand it. And luckily for me, I happened to be referred to a gynecologist who knew a lot about endometriosis, who had actually kind of specialised in it. And he explained the disease to me. I had a really good surgery, and the period part of my pain was very well managed for a long time. But I also had all these other things wrong with me through my 20s and 30s, like dizzy spells, irritable bowel syndrome type symptoms, the constant low and back and hip pain and sharp pain down the front of my right leg, and these incredible bouts of fatigue that would really floor me. And I just started to refer to myself as a hypochondriac because I didn't want it to be something that people said about me behind my back, so I would joke about it. And I really did think of myself as someone who was a bit weak. And it wasn't until 2015 I heard about this patient conference that was put on by a patient advocacy group, which is actually a mother and a daughter called Leslie and Sylvia Friedman, who were just so disgusted at the lack of information about endometriosis when Sylvia was diagnosed, that they decided to take the matter into their own hands, and they gathered all Australia's leading doctors, nurses, physiotherapists, researchers, all the leading people who knew about this disease in Australia, and they got them together in a university auditorium in Sydney, and they just invited patients to come and learn about their disease. And I went as a journalist because I thought I knew everything there was to know about endometriosis. I was in my late 30s by then. I had had it for 20 years. I'd managed, one part of it quite well. And the first time I cried was when one of the researchers got up and said that women with endometriosis are 180 times more likely to have chronic fatigue than other women. And I just was like, oh my God, that was something that I thought, I never talked about it because I was embarrassed, because I'd seen other people with chronic fatigue syndrome and I thought, oh, am I as bad as them? Maybe I was exaggerating. Maybe I am a hypochondriac. And then they talked about back pain and leg pain, and a lot of people with endometriosis have irritable bowel syndrome or painful bladder syndrome, the dizziness. Rather than being a hypochondriac, I was actually a very typical patient with endometriosis, and no one in 20 years had told me that or had put together all my symptoms into one, typical patient picture. And I mean, the hardest thing about that was, obviously I was relieved, but when you've spent so many years thinking that you are a weak person, only to discover, actually, I'm not, that all these things that are wrong with me are the same disease. It's really confronting, and I think that medicine often fails to account for that kind of second guessing that you do to yourself and what it does to your mental health, but also how you feel about yourself and your self-worth. All those things are really important.
Yeah. So if we look specifically, no, I was just going to say, if we look specifically at endometriosis, what exactly is it for those listening who perhaps are unaware of it, and what are the main symptoms? How would you know if you have it?
So it's when tissue similar to the lining of the uterus, but importantly not the same, grows outside the uterus. So most commonly it's found inside the pelvic cavity. So it often attaches and causes adhesions, attaches to the organs, and causes adhesions and inflammation and lots of pain. Sometimes all the organs in the pelvic cavity are stuck together. More rarely it's found outside the pelvic cavity on lungs, and even there's been an instance where it's found in the brain.
Gosh.
But because it has been considered the endometrium found outside, it's always been considered a menstrual disease, but actually now what they've discovered, it is a whole systems disease, multi-system disease.
Really?
Pain and inflammation are the main symptoms, but as I said, because it happens in the pelvic cavity, lots of other, bladder and bowel symptoms, and those muscles really tighten. So very commonly there is severe cramping and back, leg and hip pain as well. It can cause infertility and often kind of poor sleep and anxiety, dizziness, these kind of symptoms come along with it as well.
And do we know what causes it? Is it genetic? Is it hormonal? Is it only women who get it?
So it's not only women who get it, but it is much more common in women. There is no known cause, but there is believed to be a genetic aspect. So often someone's mother or auntie will have it. And in a world where, talking about menstruation is taboo, that's a big problem, because a lot of girls are told, oh, I had that too. Yeah, I would pass out all the time and have to be taken by ambulance. That's just normal for us. It's not normal. And if we were more okay with talking about menstruation as a society, we'd know that that is not actually normal and that should be investigated. But so there is a genetic component, but we have no idea of the cause. There's been lots of theories over the years, but there is not a good one, I don't think, right now.
In your book, you write about how doctors will frequently underestimate and dismiss women's pain. Why is this? And I mean, is there any data to back that up?
There's lots of studies that have been done to show that. There's studies that show that women wait longer in emergency for pain medication. There are studies that show both doctors and nurses underprescribe painkillers after abdominal surgery because they think that women can cope with pain better. There are studies that show both cancer and AIDS patients, women patients are less likely to have their pain treated adequately. There's study after study that proves that this is a thing. And I think it's for my book, I looked back at the history of how hysteria was treated. And this goes back to the earliest days of medicine. There's an idea that women are just, because childbirth can be painful, women are just, pain is part of a woman's life. Yeah.
Right.
And they're because of that, they're better at coping, and it shouldn't bother them. Yeah.
Whoa. So is there this sort of stigma attached then of women being perceived as being more likely to be hypochondriacs?
Absolutely. Yeah. They think that women come in, there was a cardiologist in the US who said, we're trained in medical school to be on the lookout for hysterical women who come to the emergency department. And that's how women are often treated when they go to seek medical help. There's just this idea that women can't really cope. They're very highly anxious. They'll overreact to their pain. And everything that has actually been studied shows the opposite is true. There was a study done in the US, I think it was at Harvard, that showed that women will actually delay going to emergency when they're having a heart attack. And one of the reasons is because they fear being labelled a hypochondriac. So
that is just
understand
astonishing.
This idea.
Yeah, it's kind of ingrained into us.
And the other aspect.
No,
This
go.
is a bit of a side issue, but the other aspect of that is they say women go to the doctors more. So women are forced to go to the doctors more. We have to go if we want to prevent pregnancy, have contraception. We have to go if we are pregnant. We have to go if we don't want to keep the pregnancy. We have to go when our children are little. And so medicine requires us to visit the doctor on all these occasions. And then says, oh, women love to go to the doctors.
Yeah, so no, you're so right. We're encouraged, aren't we?
Issue.
It's very much you have to go. You have to go. Get your mammograms when you're an older woman. You have to go for your cervical smears regularly. You do have to turn up. So yes, you look around a doctor's waiting room, and it is filled with women, and it is really that's really striking, though, that even if you do go to the doctor and you do get a good diagnosis of endometriosis, there still doesn't seem to be a cure. So, what is it that's holding back the research there? What's happening with women's healthcare?
So, one of the most astonishing things that I discovered in researching my book and in writing about these things for The Guardian was that medicine just doesn't know that much about women's health, because they've never studied female biology in the way that they have studied male biology. Almost everything we know about human health comes from the study of male animals and male humans. And that's a massive
even
problem,
animals.
Even animals to this day, they routinely say we can't use female animals because their estrous cycle, menstrual cycle, might interfere with the results. But
and you might not think, well, actually
interfere. You might want to know about that. Yeah.
And we now know how important our hormones are, and estrogen in particular, how it affects so many things. I was reading that drug trials don't have women participants, so we have really no clear idea in many cases of what the effects are of a certain medication for somebody with estrogen.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a huge issue. That there was a big women's health campaign in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, which changed some of that. So they had to include women in clinical trials from the 90s. Can you believe that recently?
Wow.
But that didn't change in preclinical research. So it was only in 2016 that the National Institutes of Health in the US said, if you are, you have to include female animals in your study or we're not going to give you money. But a study that looked at that last year has found that they're not really doing it properly. They're just like including one female or a couple of female animals and not analysing the results for any difference. So we're still so far from knowing the truth of that. And actually, there was a study done that showed that the drugs that were taken off the market for adverse results mostly were adverse results in women. And that's because a lot of drugs have not been adequately tested and they don't know what is going to happen on the market. And it's much harder to collect results once it's being sold to the public than it would be in a safe clinical trial.
Yeah. So what can we do about this? I mean, is there any legislation now that says that if you are researching a new drug and you're bringing it to market, that at least you have to be testing it on 50% female and 50% male participants in the trial?
That you do have to include women in human trials, and I don't think it's a law, but it's frowned upon to not include female animals. But as I said, we're still a long way behind where we should be, and I think it's about time there was legislation to enact that, because we've given them centuries to do the right thing and it hasn't happened. And I think it's time that government stepped in and did something about it, because women's health is really suffering and there's no excuses. They say, of course it sounds scary to test drugs on pregnant women, for example, but if they're going to take it after it's approved, there are safe ways to test there are certain drugs that you couldn't test on pregnant women, but there are some that don't interact with the systems that you can test in a safe environment. And we just need to listen to the amazing, mostly female, but some male scientists who are doing this work and make sure that that's done.
Yeah. Have you noticed any change since writing your book and since talking about this?
I've noticed a huge change. So after I went to that conference, The Guardian did an investigation into endometriosis, and that was in 2015. And I can't remember ever seeing the word in a media outlet before then. But it has changed dramatically since then. The BBC has done some amazing stuff on endometriosis. Lots of publications are writing about it and women's voices are being heard. So that's a great thing. But endometriosis is one of the more respectable, let me do my air quotes here, diseases that affect women, because there is a physical aspect to it. You can operate and see a physical disease and you can cut it out, and that makes doctors feel really good, and it makes women feel really good because they can say, see, I wasn't making it up. It's not all in my head. There's this physical aspect. However, lots of research has shown that the extent of the physical disease doesn't correlate to the symptoms. So you can have not many, symptoms and have really severe endometriosis lesions. On the other hand, you can have not much to see under a microscope, but your symptoms can be really severe. So there's often a chronic pain aspect of endometriosis that is at play, and that is not really being treated, because sometimes women are having multiple surgeries, 7, 8, 9 surgeries, and that's considered by experts to be really poor practice, because the more you operate, the more scar tissue, the more inflammation, the more adhesions, and that can actually increase pain after a certain time. So I do worry that endometriosis is getting a lot of publicity, but the treatments being offered are not the best treatments available. And there are other diseases like fibromyalgia and ME, chronic fatigue syndrome, and that are kind of being ignored. and they're the things you can't see under a microscope. They're the diseases that we are so far behind in our understanding of them, how the mechanisms and how they work, that they are kind of suffering the same kind of stigma that endometriosis has traditionally suffered.
If you are somebody that has chronic pain or chronic fatigue and the odd sort of pelvic twinge, so you may not immediately think, oh, there's something going on in the pelvic region that's triggering this. How would you get tested? Is there a definitive black and white test? Can they take a biopsy for a tissue sample to say definitively, oh, yes, you've definitely got endometriosis?
No, there's nothing like that. And that's a big problem because the only definitive diagnosis is looking at the endometriosis tissue under a microscope after laparoscopic surgery. So it's an invasive surgery to get a diagnosis.
Yeah.
And that is obviously far from ideal and not possible in many countries and for many women. And there are better scans now. Some kinds can be seen in a pelvic ultrasound. Some can be seen on an MRI, but it's not definitive until they've actually looked at it. And so, that's a major difficulty. And even in other chronic pain syndromes, often sorry.
Yeah. No, I was just absolutely going to come on to that there are a lot of chronic pain issues, disorders for women that aren't immediately obvious what the cause is. So do you think this could be the root of misdiagnosis in a lot of women?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, as you said, chronic pain is a big issue for women. Out of all the chronic pain diseases, the most severe ones, endometriosis, fibromyalgia, rheumatoid arthritis, osteoarthritis, migraine, they're all more common in women. They're predominantly women who make up those diseases. And I think that is part of the reason we don't understand chronic pain. Also it affects lots of different, it's perceived in the brain, but it's felt other places. There's not one specialty that really covers all the areas where pain is happening. And I just think, as I said before, because we haven't really studied female biology that much, we're really behind on understanding the mechanisms of chronic pain. And actually, even though 70% of patients, chronic pain patients, are women, 80% of pain drugs have been tested on men or male mice. So we are just not really studying the right things. One study said nothing about chronic pain in women can be inferred by the study of male animals. Nothing. So I actually spoke to a pain researcher who said to me that he thinks that there's probably really good treatments that might work on women that have just been thrown in the scientific bin because they've been tested on male animals. And the way that pain is perceived and the way that pain works is very different in the male and female brain.
This is so interesting. And I think it leads on to a discussion really about female hormones, because we now know that estrogen, for example, has such a large part to play in our immune system. I was interested, actually, I was looking at your Instagram and saw that you had put up some posts not that long ago about long COVID and how that was disproportionately affecting women. And there have been some really interesting studies ongoing here, but some early results indicating that it's women who are lower in estrogen who are having more of an issue with long COVID. And we know that estrogen is part of our immune system and our immune response. So therefore, presumably, any of these sort of autoimmune issues involving chronic pain, they must surely have a connection with estrogen somewhere, do you think?
Yeah, I have spoken to a couple of researchers who have mentioned this, but they've mentioned it in the sense that maybe it's testosterone that is protecting men from pain. And
Interesting.
the women who have really, this is still a theory, and I've just been told this by researchers, so I want to be really careful about what I say. But they are looking at whether women with low testosterone have more pain. And some studies that have been done on people transitioning have shown that people who had pain and then transitioned to men, their pain reduced, and vice versa. And so that is a really
Interesting.
interesting way to avenue, because some of the women with chronic pain had taken the pill for years and they may have low testosterone that may be making their pain worse, or more testosterone may protect them from pain. I want to be really careful about this because this is all
Yeah,
theoretical and I'm not
sure.
an expert. But absolutely we have to consider the hormonal balance for sure. And we do know it plays a role in our immune system, and it's really interesting to look at long COVID. I think it's actually a really fantastic opportunity to study all these issues and to look at how the transition from a viral infection, to longer term illnesses, because it's very common for viral infections to then trigger long-term illnesses like fibromyalgia or chronic fatigue syndrome, ME. So it's a really amazing opportunity to actually look at to study this huge group of patients and to see how the disease progresses, and to look more carefully at
Yes.
the mechanisms and what is happening in patients.
Yes. One of the things that's coming out here in the UK is looking at something called mast cell activation syndrome, or MCAS, which has been shown to be potentially driving long COVID, and that the people who are coming down with long COVID are actually suffering from MCAS. And there is this big link between histamine and estrogen and the mast cells and how that's all working. And you're right, to your point. I think this does present an opportunity. There's an awful lot of research, isn't there, that's now being fast-tracked to do with COVID. And, if we can get some results and some information specifically that are female focused. There was a really interesting study on women taking
Well,
HRT, for example, showing that they seem to be better protected from the effects of COVID, or from going into ICU if they have their
I,
hormone levels replaced.
I saw that. That was really interesting. Yeah, and actually, just last month, I think the US Congress gave $1 billion in funding to study long COVID. And this could be a real game changer. For these people have been begging for money for so long, and it's a
Couldn't
huge
it?
amount. And it came about. It came about because of lots of women and some men really lobbying. Lots of women's health groups came together with the long COVID groups and some ME groups in the US, and they lobbied together as an alliance. And this is a huge win. It is so promising and fills me with such happiness and hope.
Oh, good. Oh, it's nice to have some hope. I have to say, hearing you talk about testosterone reminded me of a couple of things. One is that I learnt not that long ago that actually women make more testosterone in their ovaries than they do estrogen. So, it's not just a male hormone, to your point about having the right
No,
balance.
yeah,
We've got to have both. And you
exactly.
guys in Australia, at the moment in the UK, we don't have a medical license to give women testosterone, which is ridiculous considering that it's part of our bodies. And in Western Australia, I
Yeah.
think they were the first to actually license it for women with a product called Androfem. So
Oh,
there
really?
is
I
there
didn't
is
know that.
research
That's
there,
great
isn't there?
news.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the researchers I spoke to did say they were giving things off label. And,
Yes.
it is so controversial. And, like, why is it controversial? As you say, we produce it in our own
Yes.
bodies.
Yeah, it's not artificial, it's just that we had it and now we don't have it. So we'd like some more, please, to
Yeah.
help with all sorts of things. But interesting that there could be this pain connection. And I think, I
Yeah,
guess
I
I
think
guess
that's
in
a
all
really
of this,
interesting
there
avenue.
is hope, isn't there? So what kind of things do you
Yeah.
find help you now? I mean, you must have got to a stage where you're hopefully able to better manage it. Do you have certain things? Do you pay attention to gut health, for example? Are there any sort of strategies that you personally have found beneficial?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh my God, my quality of life is so much better after discovering so much more about my own disease and how to manage it and finding some really
Yeah.
great doctors to help me with that. So I have, I think I have to accept that this is something that I live with and that there's not a cure,
Mm.
but I can manage it very well now and live very well day to day. It's a combination of medicine that I use, and also really important is getting the right amount of exercise. So really
Mm.
hard cardio just does not work for me. I end up in all sorts of pain, terrible pain. But so the right amount. So I found yoga, even walking, just moving the muscles in the hips is
Mm.
so important because they just tighten and clench up when they're not being moved gently. So it's day-to-day management, like getting a really good sleep pattern helps me, not overcommitting myself. I think lots of people with chronic pain, on the days they feel good, we try to do so much because we're like,
Yeah.
oh yes,
Make
I'm
up
feeling,
for it.
I've got lots of energy, I'm going to go for it, and then I suffer, the next day or during the next week. So just managing my time a little bit better, and also just knowing when I have a flare up that it's going to pass is, and understanding that it's a mechanism, and that has been really helpful to me. But there was one like really cheap little drug that a gynecologist put me on that really changed my life, and it also has improved my health, sleep. So that has really helped me too.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
It, it it's
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 a
interesting
it's an
hearing
effort.
you. Well, I mean, well done on finding strategies and also recognizing that you have flare-up days. And my daughter, who I have done podcasts with before, she has an autoimmune condition. She has MCAS and gets terrible and kind of whole
Right.
body migraines and is massively incapacitated and in huge amounts of pain. And two
Mm.
things really that she's taught me. One is that you do have these flares, and she'll journal them, and she will recognize that it is a flare, and as you say, it'll flare up but it will also flare down, and there is
Mm.
light, hopefully, eventually. But
Yeah.
also this whole awareness, I think, of hidden disability, because with chronic
Mm.
pain, such as endometriosis, it's not visible. You're not walking with a limp. You don't look ill, and yet there's an enormous amount of trauma going on inside. And I think the more aware we become of hidden disabilities, the better and the more sympathetic as a society that we'll be.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you're 100% right. That's so important to recognize.
Yeah, that not everybody is coping. They may look as if they're coping, but actually inside. I remember she
Yeah.
went to an art museum once, and she felt dreadful, but her friend wanted to take her, and she, for the very first time, sat in a wheelchair that they had at the entrance
Mm.
of the gallery, and she had a really lovely afternoon being wheeled around, enjoying the art and enjoying the exhibits. But she said when she left, she felt so guilty because she stepped out of the wheelchair, and she could see the dirty looks that
Mm.
she was getting from other people. And she felt like, raging at them. I am in chronic pain. I may be able to walk and I may not look sick, but, please just throw me a line here, because it is debilitating.
It is. And it's really important because even within medicine, if you go with chronic pain and a doctor says, tell me, on the pain scale, lots of people will have been asked this, where is your pain from 1 to 10? And
Yeah.
doctors are trained to look for physical symptoms, and when, I've broken my back, I've had broken shoulder, I've felt what they consider a 10 out of 10 pain, right? And so they, you know, it's a very different experience to chronic pain. And I feel I'm a very good person to be able to say, since I've had the worst pain, acute pain, and also chronic pain, but chronic pain is worse because there's all these other things that just make you feel so terrible. The brain fog, and you, kind of feel like you've got flu type symptoms. You just feel terrible as well as having the pain. It's very different. And doctors still aren't really trained to recognize the differences. And they'll be like, oh, well, this woman came in and she was on Facebook and she was like on her mobile. And then she tries to tell me she's in 10 out of 10 pain. Well, yeah, she doesn't have a broken bone. It's a different kind of pain. And I think that we have
Gabrielle,
to be much better, not only doctors, as a society.
it's so heartbreaking listening to you. It really is. Do discussions about mental health help, or do they make people think it's all in the mind? What's your view on that?
This is really tricky because it's not, these diseases aren't caused by mental health issues, but
Yeah.
a lot of people who have chronic pain have mental health issues, and there could be a lot of reasons for that. Poor quality of life because of a lack of good treatments, because medicine
Yeah.
hasn't studied these diseases. Also being ignored or disbelieved by, sometimes it's your friends and family who don't really believe you, as well as doctors and nurses and other healthcare professionals. And just living in pain every day is really hard. And so sometimes people do end up with depression and anxiety, which is natural. But not everyone who
Yes.
has chronic pain or autoimmune diseases has a mental health condition, and not everyone who has has depression has chronic pain. So they are very different. But I've been criticised in the past for not acknowledging that enough, to dismiss mental health concerns because of the history of women being told it's all in their head. It's so frustrating when when you go and report all these physical symptoms, people just want to talk to you about depression or put you on an antidepressant. That is enraging. But there was a survey put out during COVID asking endometriosis patients what their priorities are for access to healthcare, and access to mental health services was very high on their list of priorities. So just as we would never accept that our physical symptoms are not managed, I think we should also not accept that the mental health problems are also not managed. They should both be managed as part of your treatment. And it's not saying that one is causing the other or one is because of the other. They are part of a multi-system disease that should be, treated properly.
Yeah. Endometriosis doesn't have a cure yet, but has your journey here personally and professionally led you to be optimistic about treatments for the future?
Yeah, in one way, I'm really hopeful, and I met so many healthcare professionals and researchers who were really dedicated to helping people with endometriosis, and there is a lot more research lots more research money going into endometriosis. I think that patients should be having more of a say in the kind of research that gets funded. That's how breast cancer changed from a death sentence to being able to be treated, because women took control of the kinds of research. There's a lot of really bad research that gets funded in endometriosis. So I think that should be part of it. And another part of it has to be, it's not only the patients with endometriosis and other chronic pain conditions that are kind of stigmatised and looked down on. It's also the doctors who treat these patients. It's kind of considered yucky in medicine, and the doctors who look after it are kind of looked down on. That's not considered important or interesting, and that leads to them being paid really poorly compared to other doctors. And it also means that research money doesn't flow there because it's not considered kind of sexy or interesting. So this is a real problem that we have to deal with kind of on a macro scale. And I think it's time for kind of governments and policymakers to get involved.
Yes. I mean, I've heard it said before. Yeah, I mean, totally. I mean, the gender bias is there, definitely. And I've heard it said
Yeah.
before that with pain conditions like migraine, like ME, fibromyalgia, they're not life-threatening, and therefore, to your point, they're not sexy, they're not cutting edge, and so that the research funding doesn't tend to be there because you're not likely to die of
Yeah.
it, at least not immediately. You're just going to have to live with it, which is just not satisfactory on any level, is it?
Absolutely not. And, premature ejaculation isn't life-threatening either, but that certainly hasn't suffered from a lack of study or funding for research. We just don't think of these things the same way.
Yeah,
It,
yeah,
it is life-threatening to some people because the
totally.
mental, when you can't work, when you feel like you can't get out of bed every day, that is life-threatening. And also we are
Yeah.
denying women their humanity. We are saying your opportunities in life don't count. It doesn't matter that you suffer every single day of your life or half the time. It is just, it's that a lot of people say that it's not life-threatening, so that's why it doesn't get funding. That just doesn't stack up when you look at all the
No.
other diseases that get funding.
So what can we do about it, Gabrielle? What's your call to action for us, for everybody listening here? What can we do to try and help be part of this solution?
So I say there's three things. We have to listen to women, believe women, and study women. And I don't want to. I realise I'm leaving out some people, and I should say that there are people who menstruate who have chronic pain, and there are who might not identify as women. We must study them too. There is so much to learn, and but this is a gendered issue, so that's why I use women in that context. And this is a whole society problem, right? What is Me Too about if it's not about not listening to women? Our judicial system doesn't listen to women. Politicians don't listen to women. It's just a massive problem. But I really feel confident that medicine is capable of rapid change. And I mentioned breast cancer earlier. It was only 50 years between breast cancer being a death sentence and breast cancer being really able to be treated in a lot of women. And that was because of the work of women. And as I said, they took control of what research was getting funded, and they had a say in that. And I think we can do it again. And there is just a lot more people talking about this. There's books being written, it's on journalists' radars. We have to really push. I mean, I think there's a really sad aspect to this, that a lot of people who live with chronic pain do not have the energy to do the kind of lobbying that happened around breast cancer. So we need allies
Of course.
to help.
Yes.
And but I think that, it is a matter of social justice. And I think that the conversation has begun. And thank you so much for having me on to talk about it today, because this is the kind of thing that starts social change movements.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure, and I wish you hugely good health, and thank you very much for taking the time. And I know the time difference has been tricky, but thank you very much for being with us here. Massive success to you and your book and your work. I should be following with interest, and let's hope that we really achieve something as quickly, if not quicker, than we've done with breast cancer there as well. Gabrielle, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
And that's it for today's episode. Huge thanks to Gabrielle. And as always, you will find the links and the resources that we mentioned over on lizearlewellbeing.com. There you can sign up for our free weekly newsletter. It's filled with plenty of healthy ideas, recipes, and tips for living well, including, importantly, sleep and exercise, as we talked about just now. Huge thanks to all of you who've left such lovely reviews. It really does help others to find the show and hopefully find perhaps some help that they might need. So until the next time we chat, go well. Bye-bye. The Liz Earle Wellbeing Show is presented by me, Liz Earle, with production by Amaryllis Earle and Harry Trevithick at Heart Dialogue, with thanks to my producer Ellie Smith and guest booker Millie de la Morinière.